what I really want to focus on here, which I think is of most interest to you, and indeed of interest to me too, because here I am living in Crouch End, is the locality of Robert Paul, the sense in which he really was during the film part of his career anyway. He was absolutely rooted in Muswell Hill. And I think there's a lot more to, well, I was going to say dredge up, but there's a lot more to find out about Robert Paul's time in Muswell Hill. Very sadly, the person who did most research on that, Roland Francois Lac, sadly died earlier this year prematurely. And he's much missed by people interested in early cinema. And I would recommend you to look at his wonderful website, the Cine Tourist, which I'll mention again at the end, because if you really want to know chapter and verse and detail about Robert Paul in Muswell Hill, Roland Francois' website is still the place to go. Okay, so for beginners, who was Robert Paul? Well, Robert Paul was an instrument maker, an electrical instrument maker. He was the advance guard of a completely new profession. Electrical engineering was something completely new in the 1880s, 1890s. And young Robert Paul went to the only place where you could study electrical science, Finsbury Technical College, which is not anywhere near Finsbury Park, not anywhere near Finsbury Square, but as is often the case in London, it's somewhere else. The building no longer exists. This was the absolute center of the revolution, the technological revolution that was happening in Britain as Ayrton and Perry and Mather, these absolute pioneer scientists, were training a new generation of young electrical engineers, of whom Robert Paul was one. He graduated from Finsbury Technical College, and he set up a business in Hatton Garden. And this is, by chance, there is one photograph of Hatton Garden in the mid-1890s, and this is it that you're seeing now. It's a wonderful photograph that really kind of takes you to Hatton Garden in the late Victorian period. We think of Hatton Garden today as the center of the diamond and jewelry business, perhaps, but it wasn't at all in the 1890s. It was a very mixed, very busy street full of enterprises of all kinds, with quite an emphasis on different kinds of engineering and on novelty items. There were a number of interesting instrument makers already established who made different kinds of instruments. And there were other pioneers in their different fields. Hiram Maxim, the inventor of the machine gun, was only a few doors along from the building in which Robert Paul set up his shop. Of course, Hiram Maxim's invention, the machine gun, would hideously come into its own in the years ahead. Robert Paul is occupying a little building, a corner building. We don't know exactly how many people he's employing at this time, but he's very young. He's only 23. I checked with an historian of science who'd written a history of Imperial College, Hannah Gay, and I said, wasn't 23 a bit young to be setting up in business? He said, no, it was not uncommon in those days for people to set up a business really at, it seems to us, quite an early age. The crucial story that you have to know, which has been told by me and others many times, is that one day, two Greek-American entrepreneurs came into Robert Paul's workshop and invited him to replicate Thomas Edison's kinetoscope. What is a kinetoscope? Kinetoscope was the first practical commercial moving picture device. On the right there, you can see one of the original images that was used to actually market and advertise it. On the left, you can see a facsimile kinetoscope, which we built, which I commissioned for the exhibition at Bruce Castle. And as you can see, it's a fairly decent copy of the original. The original and I'm not going to go into great detail about this, actually ran a long strip of film which weaves like serpentine fashion over many, many rollers. It was electrically driven. That's important, I suppose, because, of course, Thomas Edison was one of the pioneers of applying electricity, creating electricity in many different contexts. And for him, it was obvious that the kinetoscope would be an electrical device. It was also a coin in the slot machine. You put your nickel in, and you saw about 45 seconds of film moving in front of the eyepiece as you looked into it. I don't think Edison really knew how successful this might be. He said that he wasn't at all convinced that it would be a success, which was why he never extended the patent beyond the US, the continental US. This opened the way for imitators, for people to build their own kinetoscopes without any fear of infringing his patent. Two people in particular took advantage of that. One was Robert Paul, who did set to work making kinetoscopes, and he probably made more than Edison actually manufactured in the end. The other, interestingly, was the Lumiere brothers in Lyon. Now, you may assume at the beginnings of cinema, owe everything to the Lumiere brothers in Lyon. Well, I'm not at all sure of that. They've certainly gone down in history as the inventors of cinema as far as France is concerned. But actually, they too got the idea of what moving pictures could be through experimenting with building an alternative to the kinetoscope. So we really should acknowledge the kinetoscope as the device that opened the way for others to plunge into the moving picture business. It was incredibly popular and very, very profitable. Even though these were expensive machines, people were queuing around the block to put their money in and to see what they could see. Robert Paul and the Lumieres quickly saw towards the end of 1895 that the way forward was not to build dozens more kinetoscopes, which are expensive and difficult machines to move around and to build. They saw that the way forward was to connect a way of running the film to a magic lantern lamp house. So is born the film projector as we think of it today. You just shine a light through the film, project it onto the screen. Lo and behold, you can entertain tens, hundreds, or even thousands of people. The Lumieres took their show to London, and they set up in the Empire Palace of Varieties on the north of Leicester Square. The Alhambra, which was an even bigger music hall on the east side of Leicester Square. Here you can see one of the photographs of it from 1896. In fact, if you look very closely at this photograph, which is the only one we have, you will see the letters animatograph. I'm moving the cursor. With a bit of luck, you'll see that. It says animatograph across the front of the Alhambra. The Alhambra had signed up Robert Paul because they had to compete with the next door empire. And we know that Robert Paul had a contract with the Alhambra, which ran for a number of years, certainly for 2.5 years, until they fell out over terms. We're very lucky to have one of Robert Paul's programs. This has survived. We don't know how, but we know that this is what he was showing on August the 31st, 1896, having started his program in March that year. And it's a very mixed program. It's got all sorts of scenes of life around Britain, a scene on the River Thames, a street scene in Glasgow, but it's also got some acted films. It's got a film called The Arrest of a Bookmaker, which Paul had made with his then partner, Bert Akers, the year before. And that was shown on a kinetoscope originally, but it was clearly able to be shown on the new animatograph projector. Now, I'm going to move through this period fairly quickly because we want to get to Muswell Hill. But it's important that you know the background. He was enjoying a tremendous success by the middle of March, over the middle of the summer of 1896. He had filmed the Derby at Epsom. The Prince of Wales had come to see the show at the Alhambra, to see his horse winning the Derby that year. Paul, at one point, was booked into at least 5 or maybe 6 music halls around London. And he was racing around every night in a hansom carriage doing the show until he trained some projectionists to deputize for him. It must have been an insane period in his life, the latter part of 1896. And he was making new films. Now, let me show you the first of the films I want to show you. This is the kind of film, this is one of the very best surviving films from that period. So here we have, and I'm going to show most of these without sound, because the sound is a bit, well, can be a bit intrusive. This is Blackfriars Bridge. And that in the background is a building which is still there, which was actually Paul's old school, the City of London School, which he had left only, what, 10 years earlier? It's an astonishing film. The more you look at it, the more you see. And I used to think, and many people still think, that it's a kind of, slice of life. Set up a camera on Blackfriars Bridge, and what do you get? Well, let me show it to you again. Just look carefully. Look at, there's much to see in it, of course, all the horse-drawn traffic. This is 1896, but just look at the succession of people who walk across. These are definitely, I'm absolutely convinced, these have all been selected, and somebody is off screen giving them a push saying, right, off you go, off you go, off you go. It has to be. It's obvious that it's such a compressed cross-section of London life that it certainly wouldn't happen by chance. We've got the old man there peering into the camera. We've got the boy with his head in a comic paper. It's a wonderful film. I've just written a new essay about it because it's such an interesting film. And of course, it's planned. Just like the Lumiere brothers organized their films that look at first like a slice of life, but the more you look at them, the more you realize that this was carefully organized. Let me show you another. This is definitely not carefully organized. This, I think, is for sure setting up a camera in Hyde Park. And of course, what it captures for us is the new craze of cycling, 1896, bicycles everywhere. But look, half the people cycling are women. There was a complete craze for women cycling at this time. And the bicycle was hailed as one of the great devices that liberated women, gave them a chance to get out, travel on their own. Very interesting scene from a social history point of view. So we're in Leicester Square. Paul is doing his show as part of the bill, the variety bill at the Alhambra. Everything's going well, but the manager of the Alhambra comes over to him at some point and says, do you think you could do something a little livelier than perhaps these slices of life that you're showing? Paul takes the cue and makes a fiction film on the roof of the Alhambra Theatre. This may sound a little strange, but quite a number of early films were shot on the roofs of theatres because you had an uninterrupted view all around. The illumination from the sky was good. And of course, you could make use of the props and the costumes from the theatre. This is what the scene was like, by the way, inside the Alhambra. We have a number of pictures because the Alhambra was a really, really popular venue. There's lots of people writing about it. The men who were big enthusiasts for the Alhambra ballet would sit in dense rows at the front watching the ballets, which the Alhambra was famous for. Paul was running his business from a shop on High Holborn, and we again have a photograph of the shop. Paul's cinematographic department, selling equipment and films. You wanted to buy a film from him for your own show somewhere else in the country or even abroad, this is where you came to get it. The problem was that Paul could see the future lay in doing more films like The Soldier's Courtship, which he had shot on the roof of the theatre. And for that, you needed space, you needed facilities, you needed a studio. He and his wife, who he had married in 1897, Ellen Paul, who was a member of the company at the Alhambra, must have looked out from Holborn, which is where they were living at the time, and somehow their eye fell upon the newly developing suburb of Muswell Hill. As far as I can tell, it wasn't actually called Muswell Hill at this period. It was called New Southgate. It was called many things, actually, but the definitive label Muswell Hill hadn't really quite cohered, hadn't quite settled. But of course, one of the dominant features of the area was Alexandra Palace, which had been there for some decades already, commanding presence overlooking overlooking where I live, which is Crouch End. I can see Alexandra Palace from my back bedroom window. So Paul and Ellen moved, and I'll show these in a different order. We don't know anything about their move except that they had moved by 1898. I made a comic book history, which you can look at online for free, by the way. And this was an opportunity to visualize what must have happened. So I'm visualizing Paul and Ellen putting their heads together and saying, we've got to move from central London. Land is cheap, perhaps, in New Southgate. So they moved to just off Colney Hatch Lane. And Paul and Ellen have lots of addresses around Colney Hatch Lane and Sydney Road. Sydney Road, which is still taking shape, they've only built one side of it, is where they eventually settle. And there they build a studio. Let me go back to where I was. This is one of the 1898 films. This is called Switchback Railway. And what's interesting about it is that it's actually, of course, made in the grounds of Alexandra Palace. I'm going to show this. I'll leave Stephen Horn's rather wonderful accompaniment running. If you know anything about Ali Pali, you'll know that there are lots of entertainments in the grounds, and a thing called the Swiss Cottage over there on the left. I think they could do with having something like this there today. It's pretty spectacular, and as far as we know, it was very, very popular. A couple of young men out on perhaps the bank holiday with their bowler hats on. This, I'm guessing, would have been shot during the period when Robert and Ellen were discovering the area around Ali Pali and Muswell Hill. So they'd moved into the area. They hadn't yet built the studio, but they were obviously finding their feet, and they saw there were plenty of subjects that were worth filming. This is what they build. It's the only photograph we have of what the studio looked like, and it's probably the preliminary version of the studio. This may be the temporary version that they built in a field off Sydney Road. If you're going up Sydney Road, this would have been on your left. Okay, still virgin territory, as it were. It's quite an elaborate studio. Pitched roof. It's got wings for flying in scenery. It's got a platform which looks like it's mounted on rails with a camera to move in and out. For its time, 1898, this is really the most advanced studio in the world. There are very few film studios at this time. Georges Méliès, who had got his equipment originally from Robert Paul, incidentally, he'd come over because the Lumières wouldn't sell him anything. So he came beetling over to London and bought a job lot of projectors, which he reverse engineered into his first camera. And that's still on display at the Cinémathèque Française in Paris. So we know for sure it happened. Méliès would build his own studio, which you may have seen in Martin Scorsese's film Hugo, very wonderfully recreated in Hugo. But actually, the studio that Méliès had was no better than, and probably less well equipped than what Paul and Ellen built on Sydney Road. Sadly, any relics of this were pulled down for a housing development. So if you go up Sydney Road today, you will see a little housing development on your left, That's a photograph of it, a recent photograph. And that is the site of the factory, the studio, etc. Just to say, why do I keep saying Ellen and Paul? Well, the reason is that Ellen was very much a partner in the business. She'd worked in the theatre. One obituary of Robert, much, much later, in 1943, by somebody who clearly knew them well, mentions that Ellen was a very able manager of the studio, and she put all her theatrical experience to work. She probably ran the costumes. She appears in a number of films, as you'll see in a moment. And I guess she was the producer or the production manager, whatever you want to call her. And one of my little ambitions at the moment is to write Ellen Paul back into the history of early cinema, because there were many women who made early cinema possible. Most of them have never been recorded in histories because why? Well, they were women and they were married to somebody who got all the credit. In this particular case, I'm convinced that Ellen Paul was an extremely active participant in the work of the studio. Robert Paul produced some very elaborate catalogues, and we have many of his catalogues, fortunately. They've been preserved. And these are some photographs blown up from the catalogues. You can see the kind of spaces. These are his employees at work developing film, finishing films. That's a big drum there where they're drying film. This studio is turning out potentially hundreds, if not thousands of feet of film a week. The orders are pouring in, the catalogs are being printed, sales are booming. Paul is even printing his catalogs in 3 languages, in English, French, and German. Clearly, he feels or knows that there's a market on the continent for his films. He is the largest single producer of films during the period 1898, 99, 100. Let me just go back to that slide. I didn't explain what was happening on the right, and you might not have had time to read it. In 1898, Paul says in his catalogue, public have been surfeited with trains, etc. Trains, trams, and buses. Beyond a few scenes whose humour is too French to please English audiences, a little dig at his French competitors, the capacity of animated pictures for producing breathless sensation, laughter, and tears has hardly been realized. This is the really stunning bit. A staff of artists and photographers have been at work in North London with the object of producing a series of animated photographs, 80 films, each of which tells a tale, whether comic, pathetic, or dramatic, with such clearness, brilliancy, and telling effect that the attention of the beholders should be riveted. Well, that is a manifesto. It appears in the trade paper, The Era, and I think it's not as well known as it should be, because it really shows that as early as 1898, Paul was nailing his colors to the mast and saying, we haven't begun to realize what film can do. And he's doing it. But look, a staff of artists and photographers. How many people was he employing? We don't know, but enough to turn out this number of films. Now, let me just, my slide seems to have temporarily frozen. This sometimes happens. Let's see if we can make it. Ah, there we are. It's going. Good. This is a general view of the works at Sydney Road, which is called the Newton Laboratories and Works. You see, it's still called New Southgate. Muswell Hill hasn't really caught on as an address yet, but it's a very impressive catalogue. And for those who are interested in such things, he was selling his film at the price of 6 pence per foot with a discount. It's a very professional organization. His main business office is still at High Holborn. That's the one I showed you earlier. The terms of trade for the film business at this time are you sell the film outright. So if you buy a 100-foot film, which runs for a couple of minutes, you're paying 6 pence per foot for it. And, you know, films are very short at this time, but you're selling it outright and whoever buys it can do what they like with it. The whole idea of renting films, which is how the trade has run really for the last 100 years, had not occurred yet. Back to Ellen, Paul. We know very, very little about Ellen. She has left really no documentary trace. We know, I discovered that the story of her marriage to Robert is rather dramatic, because a family friend wrote this down, fortunately. Apparently, Paul told her that he was sweeping her off her feet, taking her to the registry office and marrying her all in one day. And they had a wedding lunch at a restaurant on Oxford Street, I think, called Frascati's. And they moved in together in Holborn. What does she even look like? Well, that's an image of her on the left there, which comes from one of Robert's films. And I'm pretty sure it's her. It's a film of the launch of HMS Albion. And I think she's all dressed up for the occasion because it was a royal occasion. The camera sweeps past her, and I'm pretty sure that's the nearest thing we have to a portrait of Ellen. But we do also know, I think, with some certainty, that she appears in quite a number of the surviving films. And one of these films is Come Along Do, one of the first films to be made in the new studio. Now, I'm going to show you a restored version of the film. This is a little digital restoration that I've made with the help of an animator, my son, as it happens, and with the help of the Bradford Science Museum, using some of their materials. So stand by for Come Along Do, restored to its original, something like its original glory, we hope. Hopefully, yeah, you got the joke. Why does it change color? Well, first of all, why is it in color to begin with? Well, essentially, Robert Paul was offering all his films in colored versions. If anybody wanted to buy them, you paid more for the colored version because it was hand colored. But they were very popular, and clearly the presenters of early film were perfectly happy to pay quite a lot more because audiences loved colored versions. So the idea that early film was all in black and white is absolute rubbish. It wasn't. It was in color. But it's just that when archivists started copying early films, they copied them onto black and white. So we lost almost all the surviving evidence of early color film. But even more important, this is what you've just seen is almost certainly the world's first two-shot film. As far as I can tell, nobody anywhere in the world had ever made a film with two distinct scenes, the outside and the inside. And as far as I can deduce, Robert and Ellen somehow stumbled across the secret of editing and made this two-shot film. So the old couple go inside, and the old gentleman shows an unhealthy interest, as far as his wife's concerned, in a nude statue, and she pulls him away. The subject actually is a very old musical sketch. It's a song. That's the song that you heard Stephen Horn playing, and it appeared in many different media and forms. I strongly suspect that Ellen would have come up with the subject and said, hey, we can do that. It's a well-known story. It'll work. And that's a film shot on their new studio stage in Muswell Hill. Another member of the team who joined them in 1899 or so was the magician, conjurer, Walter Booth, who'd had quite a successful career. He's a touring magician, a rising young figure in the world of magic. quite highly thought of. He was a kind of pupil of David Devant, who was the linchpin, the king of conjuring at this time. And Walter Booth becomes an important part of the team at Muswell Hill. And he lived locally too, for a time anyway. He's a performer. He appears in a number of films. Amazingly, we had no idea what he looked like until really quite recently. This photograph that you're seeing on the right comes from a magic collection, the Davenport collection, and that identifies Walter Booth. We didn't know what he looked like. We could read his name in lots of catalogs and newspaper scenes, but now we can identify him in the films. And I'm going to show you at least, well, this is the most ambitious film probably that they ever made at the studio. This and a Dickens adaptation, Scrooge, an adaptation of A Christmas Carol, are the two most ambitious films. But let me just show you a little extract of this. It's pretty short, but it packs a lot in. It's called The Magic Sword. It's a Christmas film from 1901. Now, I'm going to let me mute this a little bit. You may be a little confused about what's happening at this point. Monsters are appearing. This is the good fairy who's appearing. This is our gallant knight who's just lost his lady love. This is scene 2. The witch, the wicked witch, has stolen the lady love, taken her to a cave. Cauldron is bubbling. The knight follows because the good fairy has allowed him to come. Various spirits appear out of the cauldron. The demon appears again. That's Walter Booth, by the way, breathing fire and brimstone. The witch is looking pretty smug on the left. A couple of ghosts appear. Ghosts were very popular at this time. The good fairy is about to appear, and she has got the answer. The lady love has turned back into her real self. The good fairy turns the wicked witch into a carpet, a magic carpet, obviously. And lo and behold, they're going to be restored to their family and friends. Daring cut-in of an explosion, real explosion, and we have an oldie English scene where everybody is having a feast. And guess who's going to make an appearance? The good fairy, yes. And let me just freeze that. This is the end of the film. I'll just freeze it at that point, just to give you a little insight into the film. It's about 3 minutes long. The catalogue entry, which describes the narrative, runs for nearly 2 pages. I do find myself wondering whether an audience of 1901 could have followed the story. Robert Paul had invented intertitles. He was the first person to put titles into films conveying the story, and his version of Scrooge does actually have a rather good running narrative superimposed onto the images that you're seeing, but he doesn't use titles in this one. I think it's really hard to follow. It's a sort of compressed pantomime. It's got all the elements that might appear in a pantomime, all in 3 minutes. He never really continued making that kind of film. This was pretty complex to make. A lot of multiple exposures and special effects work. We didn't have the complete film. When I first started work on Robert Paul, it stopped in the cave. But as I started to research Paul around the world, I was contacted by the New Zealand Film Archive. one of the staff of the New Zealand Film Archive said, I think we might have part of that film. So he sent me a box of photographs, which turned out to be the end of the film. This bit that I've frozen on there, that last part made it all the way, well, the whole film made it to New Zealand sometime in the early 1900s, but only part of it survived. We were able to unite the bits we have in Britain with the bit that had survived in New Zealand, and now we have a more or less restored magic sword. This is the real world of film restoration and film discovery. Paul produced about 800 films in his career. We have about 75 of those that survive. So it's not the worst attrition rate, but it's not great. That's the magic sword. And just for comparison, that's the kind of film that Georges Méliès was making in his suburban studio in Montreuil, in just outside Paris at about the same time. Very similar devices, multiple exposure, etc. Méliès today is a much, much better known figure than Paul, and some of his films have been preserved in color. Unfortunately, Paul's not, except for the one that I just showed you. Let me show you another trick film that features Walter Booth. This is a really, again, a very elaborate and very clever and ingenious little comedy. Walter Booth, as a very confident stage magician, performing in the way that Méliès would perform in many of his films. He too was a magician. Sadly, we have no idea who the actress appearing with Walter Booth is or was. She was probably local. She appears in quite a lot of the films, but we have no idea who she was. This is an interesting film, and I only discovered this relatively recently during the 2019 celebration of Paul's 150th anniversary. I discovered it online, mislabeled as a British Pathé film, which it's not. It's a Robert Paul film. And what's interesting about it is there are two things interesting, three at least. First of all, we know who's in it. It's Alf Collins, who was a very popular music hall performer and would become a very successful filmmaker and film actor right up until the end of the 1920s. Descendants of Alf Collins have got in touch with me and have provided me with documentation. They actually have letters. They've even got a telegram that shows how films were made at the studio in 1903. Basically, the people at the studio would send a telegram saying, catch the train, come up to Muswell Hill, be there at 11 o'clock in the morning, and we'll make the film. So it's all pretty clear how the studio operated. And it's very similar to the way that studios were going to start operating. Keystone Cops, Mack Sennett's studio in America, they were operating on similar lines. But this film, incidentally, What we have is the American version of it. So we know, this is from Edison's catalog, we know that this film traveled to America. Paul was exporting all over the world. And it's another delightful trick film. It says in Edison's catalog, two sports are sitting at a table enjoying a glass of beer, and they decide to lay a bet. They lay a bet. That's Alf Collins on the right there. It's worth also mentioning that boxing was actually one of the most successful subjects for early cinema. Boxing films were hugely popular right from the 1890s onwards. So it's not inappropriate that it should also be the subject of this little comedy. There are many more of Robert Paul's films waiting to be discovered in collections, in archives all over the world. My problem is to motivate archivists and collection managers to actually go and look for them. Something I'm trying to do at the moment. Now, in terms of, I'm just going to show you a couple more extracts because time is marching on. This is a very interesting film, I think, for us from a local point of view. It's called The Questionable Motorist. It was a very popular film of Paul's. We know that it traveled the world because, in fact, we have an account of somebody seeing it in Russia around about 1907. So he was really exporting far and wide at this time. And what's also interesting is that Robert Paul was himself a keen motorist, a pioneer motorist. In fact, I found an account of him being had up for speeding near Barnet. He tried to argue that he couldn't possibly have been speeding, but the judge was hearing nothing of it and fined him. This is his car that we're going to see. It's not, I don't think it's him driving it, but it's definitely his car. And again, I'll talk a little bit through this just so that you can recognize some of it. That's Coney Hatch Mental Hospital that they're driving past. That's the Orange Tree pub. Well, it's now a shop, which still exists. That's probably Robert Paul in the boater himself. He does appear in some of the films. And this, of course, is what has made the film, well, happily the film has survived. And this shows the kind of quality of trick work that Paul and Walter Booth and the others in the studio were capable of. It's a very accomplished film, 1906. Now, again, the narrative might not be immediately obvious, but basically the motorist is being, a motorist is being tried, probably Robert Paul recounting his own experiences here. And the questionable motorist, the magic motorist, crashes into the court. That's Sydney Road with only half of it built. So there you're seeing Muswell Hill taking shape in front of your eyes. Who, me? They drive off, leaving the I mean, there's a lot you can say about that car because there was a kind of running battle going on about that film. There was indeed a running sort of antagonism going on between the police and motorists around about this time. Motorists felt quite rightly that the police were busy ambushing them. And Paul, I think, is reflecting the aggrieved feeling that motorists have about unfair persecution by the police. But he was also, of course, living and working close to Alexandra Palace. And as you read the catalogs and wish that we had some of these missing films, you come across a number of titles that reflect what he would have seen happening next door in Ali Pali. You probably know Alexandra Palace was the scene of many diversions, stunts, entertainments during the early part of the century. And airships were quite a common entertainment. This is one which Paul filmed. It's a novel airship. It's the Beadle airship. We don't have the film, but thanks to his illustrated catalogs, we do at least have a still of what the film would have shown. That's from 1904. And this is just a little bit of background on Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum, as it was originally known, because that's going to figure again in the last film that I'm going to show you. It was the largest lunatic asylum, mental hospital in Britain by this time. It was opened by Prince Albert in 1851. It had up to 2,500 inmates at its height. And it actually became a kind of, it was an automatic reference if you wanted to talk about a mental hospital. There are lots of references in literature, in P.G. Wodehouse, in C.S. Lewis, even The Magician's Nephew. And there was a fire in 1903. Which led to destruction and, of course, various people wandering out of the secure asylum. I suspect that might have been the inspiration for a film that Paul made in 1907 called The Fatal Hand. This was only discovered relatively recently. And I just want to show you a little bit of it. I'm not going to show you the whole film. It's a bit longer, but I'll show you just the beginning and the end, as it were, because this is really how the dramatic films were moving on by this time. And I'm going to I filmed this off the screen. So what you're seeing is we've seen the statement: homicidal lunatic has escaped from the asylum. The old lady has got her box of treasures out, and the escaped inmate, recognizable because of his missing fingers of his hand, commits his first murder. So it's a melodramatic thriller. Films were getting longer, storylines were getting more complex. Films would make use of sets. This is a set in the studio, obviously, but they would mix sets with locations. And so what we're seeing here is the evolving language, if you like, of entertainment films. And here's a railway station, a real railway station. People have suggested it might be a Muswell Hill station, or it might be Haringey, possibly, which is my local station in Crouch End. But it's definitely a real station. And we're seeing real passengers or passengers getting on the train. There was a French-looking policeman or railway employee standing around. A reminder that a lunatic is on the loose, and he gets in, hides himself, etc., etc. And well, you know what's going to happen. There's going to be another murder. Because of time, I'm going to skip to the end of the film. As you can see, it's quite long. Basically, he's on the run, and he's pursued across what looks a little bit like Alexandra Palace Park onto a scaffolding. Police give chase. Various others join the chase, including sailors. Sailors are always very popular figures in early film. Here we have a sailor who's not afraid to scale the ladder and to capture the man and to wrestle him to the ground. So you can see this is Paul making use of locations around Ali Pali and around Muswell Hill, which appear in quite a lot of the films that we have. Just as a flashback to the beginning of it all, let me show you one of the very early films. This is 1897. This is really before they move to Muswell Hill. It's a delightful little film that's just been found in the National Film Archive in Britain. And it's called Fun on a Clothesline. And I'm pretty sure that the performer is Harry Lamore, who was a well-known music hall performer, a slack wire acrobat. And here he's doing his act on clothesline, as he would have on stage. But I think that the two figures next to him are Robert and Ellen. Looking at all the photographs we have and all the evidence, I'm pretty sure that the man in the artfully ripped jacket on the left, that's Robert, and I think that's Ellen, playing the part of the housewife, amused at the man who's messing up the washing. So I'm thinking that this belongs to the innocence, as it were, of early production. The end of the story, well, the end of the story is that in 1909, Paul, somewhat mysteriously perhaps, but in other ways not mysteriously, decides that he's going to get out of film production. He has got very good reason to get out of film production because the industry is really ramping up hugely in Europe and particularly in America. Films are flooding the market, and some of these films are very elaborate, very expensive indeed. And I think Robert and Ellen draw the conclusion, the entirely correct conclusion, that they've either got to invest enormously in expanding the studio or maybe to quit while the going is good. But there may have been another trigger. We know that they did a sort of super production in 1909, which is called The Burning Home. We know that there's a big ad in the trade press for it. The scene of this film in Commercial Film Archive, the Huntley Archive, and I've just filmed this off the editing machine when we discovered it. So what you're seeing actually is Vine Cottages, which was a row of old buildings at the top of Colney Hatch Lane, just before it crosses over the North Circular Road today. Of course, new houses have been built on this site, but it's pretty clear from what you can read about the making of the film that they actually did set the cottages on fire. Maybe they were due for demolition, we don't know. This is a real fire. It's a real fire brigade. It's the climax of the film where a man is rushing back because word has reached him that the family home has caught fire. There are children and his wife, they're distraught. The firemen are in action. And it gives you some sort of sense of the lengths that Robert Paul had to go to by this stage in his career. And the story that I pieced together is that basically this was an expensive film to make for various reasons, and it really didn't deliver the returns that they had hoped, despite all the publicity and despite the efforts. And I think this may have been the final straw. It may have been that making The Burning Home convinced Robert and Ellen that it was time to get out of the film business, probably. So they did. And rather sadly, rather unfortunately, they decided to destroy his stock of negatives. The business that Paul had started, of course, was an electrical instrument business. Excuse me. Filmmaking had only ever been, he insisted, a sideline to his very considerable electrical instrument business, which continued on this site until the 1950s. Paul and Ellen left the house they built, that's the house you're seeing there on Sydney Road, and they went to live in a very grand house in West London, Addison Gardens, where they lived for the rest of their lives. They continued to use the area for a number of films. This is another of their films, shot in and around Sydney Road. And that's what the location looks like today. And those images come from Roland-Francois Lac's wonderful website, The Cine Tourist, my local filmmaker, which is still online, which I think you would find particularly interesting from a local history point of view. If you want to see the story of Robert Paul in graphic form, that's my comic book version of it online, simple booklet. Put in Time Traveler, Robert Paul, and it'll take you directly to it. And my book, published by Chicago University Press. Sadly, nobody in Britain wanted to publish it. So I took it to Chicago University Press, who were delighted to publish it. And it won a prize, quite a substantial prize last year, an American prize. He and Ellen had 3 children. Sadly, they all died in infancy, very early infancy. It's a very tragic story, really, because their first child was called Thomas Newton Paul, and Newton Avenue, that little road that I mentioned, I think is clearly named after their son, who had died at the age of 7 months. There's a story that goes with it that he accidentally took something poisonous and died of convulsions. The other 2 died in much earlier infancy, really as newborn babies. It took a long time to discover this because there's no family, there's no surviving family. There were 3 children, but it was incredibly difficult to discover the actual birth and death certificates. I mean, you would think with the kind of computerized resources we have today that it would be easy. I can tell you it wasn't. It was another figure who sadly left us 2 years ago, a very distinguished historian, Richard Brown, who set to work to solve the riddle of Robert Paul's children, and he did it. This is a man who never used a computer in his life, but his skill at archival research was absolutely extraordinary. I remember Richard telling me triumphantly that he found the missing children, sadly dead in early infancy. But I have to pay tribute to Richard, who was a tremendous help to me in the research, because just to piece together this life of Robert Paul, it's more difficult than you would think. The man left no trace. He once said that he was rather averse to personal publicity. Boy, was he averse to personal publicity. He left absolutely no trace at all. So what I've been able to piece together has come from many, many different sources. And there are still a lot of gaps in the story, but at least we have the narrative of his life.